Midweek Murders contains graphic and explicit content. Listener discretion is advised.
Guess who's vaccinated? This bitch! Catch me outside. Oh yeah, you can't because you're not vaccinated! I'm just kidding, I wouldn't go outside. That would require having a life.
Wow. My dad got his vaccine today.
Ooh, congratulations to your dad.
'Cause he's an old man.
Should we start, maybe? Smack this out of the park.
You're the one in a rush.
A bit, a little bit. And not only because I'm on the beer, so there might be a pee happening.
Multiple toilet breaks.
Yeah, I did go to the toilet beforehand, but, just runs right through me. Are you hungover today, or are you drinking?
I'm a drinky smurf.
Nice. I have Hop House. Wonderful.
Me too.
Ooh, wonderful, wonderful. Oh, it's almost like we're matching today. Sisters!
But only 4 left because I got a bit carried away yesterday.
Whoops. What did you do yesterday? Watched footy?
Oh god, don't call it footy.
No, I realized I couldn't. I was like, no, it doesn't work for you. Retract! Oh, I'm gonna burp. Wait. There it goes. Yeah, we're ready. We're ready and at it. It's Wednesday, which means that it's time to talk about crime. You're listening to Midweek Murders, and I'm your host, Sandra.
I'm your host, Joe.
So this week we're going to talk about Patricia Stallings, who was sentenced to life in prison for the murder of her son, Ryan. I got my information from the National Registry for Exonerations, article in Science Mag by Michelle Hoffman, Wikipedia, a book called Genetic Twists of Fate by Stanley Fields and Mark Johnston, and an article on Justice Denied. Denied.
I got mine from unsolved.com, an educational law website, which I assume is some university. National Institute of Health website, acmt.net. No idea what that stands for.
Exciting.
But it was an annual scientific meeting. No, it doesn't stand for exciting. And then 2 journal articles, one called Ethylene Glycol, Glycolic Acid and Metabolic Acidosis of Unknown Origin, and another one called Misidentification of Propionic Acid as Ethylene Glycol in a Patient with Methylmalonic Acidemia. And that is a mouthful.
Cool. So, Patricia Stallings had led a difficult life as she had been homeless for a while and at one point had to give up her son for adoption as she had been accused of child abuse because of neglect.
But how many children does she have?
At that point, only one.
But not Ryan.
Yeah, that wasn't Ryan. It was another one.
Okay.
Yeah. But in the mid-1980s, she had managed to get her life back on track and had secured a job as a store clerk in St. Louis. Patricia had met her husband David at her place of work as he was a regular customer at the store. They got married in 1988, moved into a nice house close to Lake Wawanoka. We'll go with that, I'm sorry, and we'll move past it. And in 1989, the couple had a son who they named Ryan. In a quote from the book Genetic Twists of Fate, Patricia stated that truly was the happiest time of my life. Everything was perfect. Everything. A new house, a new baby. I mean, what could go wrong? Ever since he was born, Ryan seemed to suffer from gastric distress. And here I have my first question. In Sweden, we have this thing called Colic, which is when babies cry all the time. They say that it's when the baby have an upset stomach constantly. Is that gastric distress?
No.
Oh. What is that in English?
It's colic.
Is it?
I was expecting the story to be something that wouldn't translate and I'd have no idea what you were talking about. And you were like, it's called colic. Oh, yeah, colic.
That makes so much sense. Oh, well, all right.
Yeah, so colic is, like you said, when a baby is distressed and crying and there's no known reason behind it. Gastric distress would be things like vomiting and diarrhea. So only things that are involved with digestion and the gastric tract.
Okay. So it's like what I have, but
But a recognized medical condition, not
oh,
this hissy, my bowels don't work kind of nonsense that you've got.
well, it's kind of the same thing as colic as a child, because they're like, there's something wrong with your digestive tract. We can't really do anything about it. Good luck.
Yeah, so IBS would coincide with the bottom half of gastric distress, and gastric distress is kind of an umbrella term, so IBS is probably included in that somewhere.
And also, we do vomit. Not all of us, but I do. Not that often, but you know.
Oh, well, that's because you've got a drinking problem.
No. No, it's because when I get stressed, my acid reflux kicks into high gear.
It's got nothing to do with anything other than your alcohol consumption.
Sure, okay.
I did not study 7 years in medical school for you to tell me you've got acid reflux.
And the best punchline of that joke was that you opened the beer right after you said it. Yeah. So when Ryan was 3 months old, Patricia took him to the emergency room at Cardinal Glennon Children's Hospital in St. Louis on the 7th of July 1989, as Ryan had fallen acutely ill. He couldn't seem to keep his food down, and Patricia noticed that he seemed lethargic and that he had trouble breathing. At first, she had arranged to go to another hospital, but Patricia claimed that she got lost on the way there, which I'm guessing people found suspicious because it was noted in a lot of the articles and stuff that I read. Anywho, Ryan was placed in the pediatric intensive care unit. Oh my God,
Why did you pick a case that's all about hospitals? You know there are going to be words in there that neither of us can say.
And with neither of us, you mean me.
Yeah, I was being nice.
Yeah. And Patricia and David checked into the hospital hotel, which I'm not sure it was a hotel, but they rented a room at the hospital. And I was like, I'm going to put this in my own words, so we'll just call it the hospital hotel. There might not be one. Disclaimer, over. The hospital did some tests, and when the results came back, they showed that high levels of ethylene glycol was found in Ryan's blood, an ingredient found in antifreeze and acetone. For us non-Americans, antifreeze is an engine coolant? Question mark?
No. One, antifreeze is not an American thing.
Oh, okay, cool. I don't know.
And two, you're kind of in the right ballpark with it being engine coolant. It's part of what's used in the fluids of engine coolant to stop it from freezing in low temperatures.
Okay.
It's also widely used in the aeronautics industry and is one of the biggest pollutants, minus, jet fuel, from the air industry, because they pour it all over their planes and then it rains and it all gets washed into the water system.
Oh, I didn't know that. So now I'm going to ask you what ethylene glycol is. It's like a manufactured thing?
Yeah, it's synthetic. Particularly in the US, it's ingested a lot in suicide attempts. So a lot of the hospitals will get ethylene glycol poisoning cases. It also presents a very similar set of symptoms to inherited metabolic diseases.
Yeah, we'll get to it so we don't spoil anything.
Got to give you the symptoms of ethanol.
Oh, how the tables have turned. Oh, I found that way too satisfying.
Yeah, you did.
Okay, sorry, I'm finished.
The symptoms of ethylene glycol poisoning are vomiting, abdominal pain, renal failure, coma, and quite interestingly, like with alcohol poisoning, the medical treatment for ethylene glycol ingestion is to administer ethanol,
Oh,
which is an alcohol. So yeah, ethylene glycol has no natural role in the body. It's poison, it's toxic. It is manufactured for its low freezing point to be used in antifreeze products.
oh, cool, yeah. So Dr. Robert Lynch, who was the person treating Ryan, got understandably worried and notified the relevant authorities about his suspicions that Ryan had been poisoned. And with understandably worried, I'm not sure if that's accurate.
To be fair to the doctor, you send the blood tests off and you get a result from the lab and you assume that what comes back from the lab is correct.
Yeah.
So from his point of view, understandably, he would be concerned because this sample's come back with poison in it.
Yeah. So Ryan was then placed in a foster home and was not in Patricia and David's care for 3 months, although Patricia was allowed to visit him with a social worker present. On one such visit, on the 1st of September 1989, Patricia was left alone with Ryan for a couple of minutes as she fed him from a bottle. And 4 days later, Patricia was apprehended outside of her home. At the police station, she was informed that Ryan was in the hospital, but she was not allowed to visit him. Patricia stated about the arrest that I kept thinking this would all get straightened out. I thought somebody would figure this out. They'd say, oops, and we'd all go home. The police had arrested Patricia because they thought that she had poisoned Ryan with the baby food/drink in the bottle at her last visit with him. He had been hospitalized only 3 days later and had passed away on the 7th. They also claimed that there were traces of ethylene glycol on this bottle. Antifreeze was found in the basement of the Stallings home, although I don't think they ever denied that they owned antifreeze. And Patricia was charged with first-degree murder, and although she didn't know it at the time, she was pregnant. In February 1990, Patricia gave birth to another son, David Jr. He was put into foster care, and both Patricia and David were refused visits with him. Only weeks later, David Jr. was taken to the hospital as he had fallen ill with the same symptoms as Ryan had suffered from. And the hospital he was taken to was the same one Patricia had first arranged to take Ryan to before getting lost on the way and settling on Cardinal Glennon Children's Hospital. At the hospital, David Jr. was diagnosed with methylmalonic aciduria, MMA for short, a rare hereditary disease. So, what is MMA? And not the mixed martial arts.
Oh, it's when people kick and punch the shit out of each other inside a ring. Methylmalonic aciduria is an inherited metabolic disorder. So in this case, it's from a recessive gene, which means that you need to inherit one gene from both of your parents who will be carriers. So in the words of the Hunger Games, the odds are ever in your favor.
Oh.
Right, thought you'd enjoy that. So, to put it into perspective, if 2 carrier parents were to have 4 children, 2 of them would be completely unaffected, 1 of them would be positive for, and 1 of them would be a carrier for MMA. Methylmalonic acid will stop you from being able to break down certain proteins in your diet, which causes a toxic buildup of methylmalonic acid, which is what then causes the toxic symptoms and the side effects. So in your diet, there are 4 amino acids that you would break down in your body from proteins. So you eat a bit of chicken, that chicken's full of protein. That protein might include isoleucine, valine, methionine, and threonine. Those are the 4 amino acids that are affected by MMA. Your body will break that down into propionyl coenzyme A. That will break down into methylmalonyl coenzyme A, and that will break down into methylmalonic acid. When it gets to methylmalonyl coenzyme A, there are more steps in a normal metabolism to break it down further for you to then be able to use that as an energy source. In patients that suffer from methylmalonic aciduria, it stops there. So the methylmalonyl coenzyme A just all gets converted into methylmalonic acid, and you can't get rid of it, and it builds up and builds up and builds up until you start exhibiting symptoms. Now, the interesting part is that this is an inherited metabolic disorder. So children have it from birth. They've always had this condition, but it only starts exhibiting itself when the diet changes from breast milk or placental absorption onto artificial food, because then the protein ratio changes, or when they move on to solid food and start eating normal proteins and carbohydrates, and that's when the build-up starts happening. So that's why there's a delay between, how old did you say Ryan was? 3 months?
Yeah.
So yeah, he would have been breastfed or pumped and would be having his mother's milk, which would have already broken down the proteins, to being on formula milk, which will have those proteins in them that they assume the child can break down. And that's when it starts building up and going wrong.
And that's why David Jr. was taken into hospital much sooner, right? Because his mother wasn't in the picture.
Yeah, so he would have been moved on to artificial milk pretty much straight away. Was he weeks old when he was first admitted?
I think
Yeah.
so.
But there's no cure for MMA, and there's no cure for a lot of IEMs. But there is a treatment plan which involves a low protein diet and a lot of supplements and certain drugs that can aid the body in the metabolism process. Apparently, 1 in 90,000 babies in the US are diagnosed with MMA. But the good thing is that there are nationwide protocols that are looking at newborn screening to give children the best chance of survival. That's MMA. I'm done.
Done. Cool. Moving swiftly on. Because of David Jr.'s diagnosis, Patricia's lawyer realized that Ryan must have died from MMA rather than having been poisoned, but he presented no evidence to prove that theory. The judge decided that Patricia's lawyer wasn't allowed to present this theory to the jury, but he did tell the jury that Ryan could have died of natural causes. George B. McElroy III, that's a name and a half, the prosecutor, responded, "You might as well speculate that some little man from Mars came down and shot him full of some mysterious bacteria." Which, no, that is not at all what he's saying. And also, what?
So I've got another quote from our Georgie boy.
Oh God, here we go. Okay.
Regarding the decision to release to the jury the information that Ryan could have had methylmalonic aciduria, begin quote. "We were concerned that if it came out that Ryan had this methylmalonic aciduria, we believe that would not be relevant and might cause the jury to make a decision based on something that's really not relevant." End quote.
Oh my God.
So what you're doing there, Georgie boy, is withholding evidence.
Yeah, it's the exact same symptoms. Both children had it. Patricia was not allowed to see David Jr. at all. I don't understand how that could be irrelevant in any way. It is the most relevant. I got so annoyed. Oh God.
But also, during the trial, there was a note passed between the judge and Georgie Boy, and that note had on it a confession from the treating doctor. If we go back to this boy who I previously defended as seeing the lab results and just trusting them, that note said that the treating doctor considered the possibility of methylmalonic aciduria, but decided not to test for it.
Oh, what?
Because there's nothing like putting the safety of your patients first.
I retract all of my faith that I had presumptuously put in him. I feel like this is crazy, but oh well. I read a lot of things about experts that testified that he must have been poisoned and stuff like that, but I didn't include that. But just so the listeners know, the prosecution put up a lot of experts that said that he must have been poisoned even though his symptoms from being poisoned with ethylene glycol would have presented itself earlier than after 3 days of the exposure.
And would have responded to treatment.
Yeah.
He went through hemodialysis and was treated with ethanol. If you catch that early enough, those are the antidote to ethylene glycol poisoning. So he would have recovered.
So I feel like these experts, in quotation marks, must have not been that knowledgeable after all. Or maybe they just chose to admit that. I don't know.
So while we're on the topic of the criminal proceedings, it was posed in court that it could have possibly been methylmalonic acid, urea.
Urea.
It could possibly have been methylmalonic aciduria. The prosecutors argued that there was an important and significant difference between ethylene glycol and propionic acid, and so they believed that Ryan had still been poisoned. Now, to explain, propionic acid is a naturally occurring acid in the body, but it also has a significant build-up with patients who suffer from MMA.
Okay.
The reason that they made that distinction between ethylene glycol and propionic acid is that it was questioned that with them being similarly structured, they could show the same signs on analyzers as each other. So I did some digging. The chemical formula of propionic acid is C3H6O2. The chemical formula for ethylene glycol is C2H6O2. So these two compounds differ by one carbon atom. And in the eyes of the prosecution, that was enough to be able to say, nope, the analyzers would be able to pick that up. It's totally fine. Ignore it.
Wait, I have a question. It might be a stupid question, but I'm going to ask it anyways. What kind of results do the analyzers show?
I looked this up as well. I'm a star. Back in the days before triple quadrupole GCM SMS, I know that's a lot of things that you will have no idea about.
Yeah. Me and the listeners. We're in the same boat here. I'm rowing. You might as well go swim.
Ethylene glycol was detected by a method called GCFID. So it's gas chromatography with a flame ionizing detector. Basically, what this is that it will suck up your sample, carry it along, like a vacuum. Not anything like a vacuum, but for the sake of layman.
Okay.
It will be carried along by a gas into a column that will separate everything in your sample out depending on reactivity. Don't need to go into that too much. And then it passes into the detector. The detector ionizes it. Ionizing is basically just breaking your compound up. So where the propanoic acid is C3H6O2, it will break it up into C2 and you'll get a fragment there. So it just kills it, basically. On your detector, you will get a peak where your sample has come off of the column and entered into the detector. So they were looking at peaks. So in your graph at the end that you would look at to determine the result, along the x-axis, which is the one that runs along the bottom, is time. So that's just recorded in minutes. And then up on the y-axis is intensity. So you will get sort of a flat line from time 0. It will carry on nice and flat, and then your detector will pick up something, in this case propionic acid, so it will shoot up, and then your propionic acid has all passed through, so it will come straight back down, and it will look like a nice tall peak. To be able to compare that, you would run a positive control. In one of those samples that you would run would be a known sample of ethylene glycol. So you put that in and you know the concentration, and it comes out and gives you a retention time, which is the time that the peak comes out, and a peak intensity. Then you run your patient sample and then you compare the two. So what they did, they compared the two, and the reason that it was mistaken was because the person interpreting the chromatogram, or the graph that comes out at the end, was a lazy fucking arsehole. There's no nicer way to put it, because I've seen the graphs, well, not the actual graphs that they looked at, but I've seen someone run ethylene glycol on GCFID, and I've seen them overlay propionic acid.
Yeah.
It's fucking lazy.
Is it? Because I have this all in my head now. I can see it in front of me. And to me, it does seem like it would be similar.
They are similar,
Yeah.
but there are differences. So when we go back to the chemical structure of the two,
Yeah.
propionic acid has that extra carbon atom. Now, chromatographically speaking, that makes fuck all difference, because carbon atoms do not react on an analytical column.
Oh, that just makes it seem even more similar.
It does, but the way that the compounds are differentiated between that is that ethylene glycol has 2 OH groups.
Mm-hmm.
An OH group being commonly what you would find in an alcohol. So the reason that you can identify an alcohol is because structurally they all have an OH group. So ethylene glycol has 2, 1 on each end. Propionic acid only has 1. And the other one is a double bonded oxygen. Now, I know we're getting into quite deep chemistry here, but a double bonded oxygen is not reactive. So when propionic acid passes through a column, the only points it's got 6 points of reaction.
Mm-hmm.
Ethylene glycol has 8.
That is a difference.
It is a difference. It might seem like only a small difference, but the whole point of a chromatographic column is to separate compounds of similar nature.
Yeah, and also you should be able to tell the difference between 6 and 8, if this is your job.
Well, not necessarily, because the 6 and 8 isn't an obvious thing. The only way that that relates is the amount of time it spends on the column.
Okay.
So between propionic acid, which has got 6, and ethylene glycol that's got 8, immediately looking at those two structures, you know that ethylene glycol is going to be on that column for longer. So your ethylene glycol peak on your chromatogram is going to come out later. The time that it comes out on the graph will be later because it's stuck in the column for longer. So one of the papers that I read actually got the data from the lab that tested it. So at 0.69 minutes, ethylene glycol came out. At 0.63 minutes, propionic acid came out. If you're recording that and just looking at it, 6.3, 6.9, they're quite similar. The amount of data that is being processed by the computer to be able to create this graph means that the breakdown is at 0.001 minutes. So it will scan the detector every 0.001 minutes and look for any signal.
Oh, so it is a huge difference.
Yeah, the difference between 6.3 and 6.9 is massive.
Yeah.
The easiest way to look at it is when you are running these samples, you would have run your positive control. That positive control is just ethylene glycol.
Mm-hmm.
So it goes through and you get a peak at 0.69. Wonderful. You run your patient and suddenly your ethylene glycol has shifted by almost a minute.
Yeah.
That immediately in chromatography is an issue because one, your automated software won't even pick it up as the right peak. And two, it's coming out almost a minute earlier. You should know that that peak coming out isn't the same peak. It would be a lot easier if we did this as a video podcast because it's so much easier to explain with that chromatogram in front of you than it is just trying to do it all verbally.
Yeah, but you do have the chromatograms, no?
They're in one of the sources, yes.
Yeah, so maybe we could put it up on the website, midweekmurders.netlify.app, so that people can look at it if you are interested, listeners. Okay, so Patricia Stallings was then sentenced to life in prison in January 1991, and I think the judge wanted the death penalty as well, but I'm not sure. I read that in one of the sources. In May that same year, her case was featured on the television program Unsolved Mysteries. And luckily, William S. Sly, in his zip-up zebra one-piece, cozied up on the couch with his cat, Charles Cheddar Twiddlington V, watching that same program.
This is what all of us biochemists do in our spare time. And all of our animals are named as extravagantly.
Well, disclaimer, none of that is true, except for him having watched the show. William S. Sly, a professor and a chairman of the Department of Biochemistry and Molecular Biology at St. Louis University, conducted tests of Ryan's blood and found that Ryan had died of MMA.
Just like to point out, ran the samples, immediately saw that Ryan suffered from MMA. No
yeah.
second testing or referring elsewhere. Like one batch, done.
Yeah, which does make me worried about the people who work in these labs, but all right.
Nah, you're all right in the UK. We're good at what we do.
Okay. He and James Shoemaker, head of a metabolic screening lab, who confirmed the absence of ethylene glycol in Ryan's blood, then contacted Piero Rinaldo, a metabolic disease expert from Yale University, who persuaded the prosecutor that Patricia was innocent. And this is a summary of what happened. From what I understand it, they also sent out these blood samples, maybe his or maybe someone else's, to a lot of independent labs and found that a lot of the labs returned a positive for ethylene glycol poisoning, even though it clearly wasn't.
And by a lot, it was half, which is disturbing.
Yeah. So the prosecutor, McElroy, asked the trial court to order a new trial because of inadequate legal defense based on these scientists' evidence.
I don't understand what Georgie Boy's doing, because on the one hand, he's prosecuting like a bat out of hell, and he's like, let's just ignore counter-evidence, this is all bullshit. And then more counter-evidence of the same ilk comes forward, and he's like, actually, your defense lawyer was shit, we'll give you another trial.
Yeah, I also felt like that was a ploy to exonerate him from, like, having done anything wrong, but I feel
for
like
being personally sued, yeah.
he did do stuff wrong, so I don't really understand, but all right. Patricia was released from prison in July 1991, and in September, McElroy dropped the charges against her and apologized.
Soz, mate.
Yeah. And David Jr. was returned to his parents, thank God. I read that she sued the state or the prosecutor. The state, probably?
I think she sued the state and the lab that ran the tests.
Yeah, that makes sense. But she also donated money to the person who ran against McElroy for the prosecution office, which I thought was the best.
Yeah, $10,000.
Mm-hmm.
And he
I
won.
think he won. Yeah.
Yeah.
Excellent. Excellent.
Money well spent.
So that's the case.
Kablamo.
So what are you gonna do now? Maybe quiz, I'm hoping?
I was going to say, aren't we going to quiz?
Yeah, if you wanna.
There's not a live one to play. They're not doing any in March, but I found one that we haven't done yet.
For the listeners, for context, we sometimes do a Harry Potter quiz on Reddit that they post on Wednesdays. Is that true?
Tuesdays is the live game. The home game's on Wednesdays.
So for any Harry Potter fans out there, there is a quiz on Reddit. Which subreddit is it on?
Dueling with one L.
Okay. Is that the American version of that spelling?
No, I think the real spelling was taken up by someone else.
Oh, okay, that makes sense. I was like, they usually don't remove L's. It's more about the Z's.
More about the vowels.
That too.
Colour? Who needs a U in there?
To be fair. Okay, thank you so much for listening to this week's episode of Midweek Murders. We'll see you next week. Bye-bye.
Bye.